Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for October through January. Over the last 30 days, we've seen cooler and wetter conditions, especially across the western half of the Great Basin. We have had some drier spots, however, of the Great Basin, namely up into parts of central and southern Idaho and also the eastern half of Utah. These areas have largely remained out of the above normal precipitation we've seen in many other areas. Looking at just the summertime precipitation from early June through the end of August, you can see we had a very healthy monsoon, especially targeted from Southern California up north through Nevada, eastern Oregon, and up into Idaho, Wyoming, and northern Utah. These areas were well above normal precipitation during this time period. We also had some tropical features that added to the monsoon moisture, which really brought these heavy wetting rains at times for the western half of the region. We did have some drier spots again over eastern Utah. This area largely remained out of much of the monsoon moisture, as did much of the Four Corners area, and then parts of the Arizona Strip and southwest Utah were closer to normal. If we look at the entire water year, which dates back to October 1st, 2022, through almost the end of the water year, almost the very end of September, but really much of the precipitation will be included in this, you can see for the Great Basin, we've generally seen near to above normal precipitation, generally region-wide. There are some holes over parts of central and southern Idaho, and as you go further north and west, some of the drier spots, and then also some spots over eastern Utah, but for the most part, the Great Basin did see near to above normal precipitation when you take into account all of the monsoon precipitation and all of the winter and springtime precipitation we saw last season. Currently, our fire danger is very low across the region. We do have some spots on the drier side of central Idaho and over eastern Utah that are kind of flirting with that 50 to 80th percentile with respect to ERCs. So these are, again, some of the areas that not only the brush is the driest, but also that the grasses are the driest as well. Although we are seeing above normal grass fine fuel loading over southern Idaho and the northern half of Nevada, just from the winter and spring precipitation we saw. So those grasses will dry out obviously much quicker than the ERCs will indicate. So when we do have windy conditions, especially with cold frontal passages, after a prolonged period of warm and dry weather, certainly we could see some runs in the grasses, especially as we go through the fall, namely going through October and November and into the early part of December before really the snow starts in the lower elevations. So again, ERCs generally low, but doesn't really paint the full picture when we're looking at still some of our live fuel moisture in the brush is still relatively low, which we'll look at next. And then also our grasses are still dried from being cured this summer, and then they will transition into dormancy. So now looking at some of our sagebrush conditions, here's some of our live fuel reports, and these are some of the most recent reports either from mid-September or late September heading into October. So up in Idaho, you can see our live fuel moisture for sagebrush is still generally below the 100% line. So still critical, still could carry fire under the right conditions, obviously, depending on the weather. And then over into Nevada, we're also seeing similar conditions, although this is back towards mid-September. Many of our other live fuel moisture sites have not been updated. We have had some issues with the website and the data entry, but for the most part, we expect these conditions across the Great Basin in areas that have not seen, especially the more significant recent moisture. Looking at our drought monitor, with our wet conditions we saw over the last year or over a year, our drought has continued to gradually decrease, and now we really are almost drought-free across the Great Basin. Some areas that are still hanging on to either abnormally dry conditions or very small areas of moderate drought are far southern Nevada, the Arizona Strip, and parts of eastern and southeast Utah, again, that have remained kind of on the drier side of many of our recent surges of moisture. We're not really anticipating any change to our drought outlook, so are not looking for any new areas of drought to develop, and probably much of the drought we have will probably stay fairly similar heading into the fall and winter months. So now now that we've looked at what has been going on in the past and currently, we'll look ahead to the forecast, and we'll first look at El Nino, La Nina. We have been coming out of this 3-year cycle of La Nina, and we have been transitioning into now warmer ocean temperatures in the equatorial Pacific, which pushes us into El Nino. All of these lines here are just different forecast models for sea surface temperature, and again showing that warming trend as we go into the fall months and the winter months. Really a very likely scenario to stay in El Nino going through the fall and winter, which certainly has some impacts for our weather out west. And then as we go into next spring and fire season, possibly a cooling scenario where we transition more into a normal category or a weaker version of El Nino. So what that means for our impacts across the Great Basin, most impacts from El Nino and La Nina are felt during the winter months. So later this winter, this would be a typical pattern that is associated with an El Nino where we have the warmer or cooler, wetter conditions down south and warmer, drier conditions up north. As you can see, much of the Great Basin, especially much of Nevada, Utah, and southern Idaho, are kind of in the middle or sort of in the null zone, so to speak, which really could go either way. We have seen El Ninos that have been wetter up north, but those are not quite as frequent. So again, this is kind of the pattern we're looking for, with a better chance of wetter conditions through the winter, mainly over the southern half of the Great Basin, and potentially drier conditions for Idaho and Wyoming. So looking at the last 7 to 14 days, we have had generally wet conditions up north into the central areas of the Great Basin, with much drier conditions across Idaho, Nevada, and into eastern Utah. And looking a little bit into the future, a very short term here, just going into the first part of October, we do have a very strong cold front that's moving through the Great Basin for the early part of September, or later part of September, early part of October. This will bring some significant wetting rains to some areas, as you can see by the schematic here, showing the better chances of widespread wetting rains across Nevada, Idaho, down into central and northern Utah and Wyoming. Also, much colder temperatures will drop the snow levels, so we will see new snow in the higher elevations of many areas of the Great Basin. So this will be the start of our outlook period and really starting us into the fall weather pattern. So looking a little bit further ahead towards the middle of October, generally showing possibly warmer and drier conditions. So we'll continue to watch that as this first cold front moves through. We'll definitely see a period of warmer and drier conditions heading closer to the first half of October, and then we'll see what the later part of October brings. Right now it's looking like generally warm and dry for northern areas, and this pattern really continues going through November and December, January, really just mirroring that El Nino weather pattern, with the better chances of above normal or wetter conditions generally over the southern half of the Great Basin. Now, whether that means just southern Nevada, southern Utah, and Arizona, or whether those wetter conditions extend further north to include much of Nevada and Utah, remains to be seen, but that potential is certainly there as we head into the winter months, with again a better chance of drier conditions for Idaho and Wyoming going through at least the early part of winter. So putting everything together, we are looking for generally normal conditions with fire potential really through the outlook period. That would be very low for the time of year. It's technically considered our off season. The only caveat would be through October and November, especially in areas that we do have above normal fine fuel loading from our winter and spring precipitation earlier this year, which would be the Snake River Plain, parts of northern, western, and central Nevada, possibly northern Utah. Those areas that have higher fine fuel loads as those grasses transition into dormancy. If we do have these longer periods of warmer, drier conditions, and then that is followed by a strong cold front with strong winds, we could see runs with any fires or any new starts that do occur. Likely this time of year, not usually from lightning. However, if we do have some human starts, we could see brief upticks in fire potential for a burning period or so before the colder temperatures and higher humidities typically come behind the cold front. But aside from that, it's looking like generally normal, generally tranquil conditions through the winter. That concludes our seasonal outlook for this month. Check back at the beginning of November for our next outlook.